Thanks very much, everyone. This is a session that the late Noel Whelan, our founder, and I long thought about, and we always wanted to have the law a central part of the Kennedy Summer School. And indeed, this is a session I think will be of huge interest, not only to lawyers, but to anyone with an interest in the law and how the law is portrayed in our media, in particular in the wake of several very high-profile, controversial trials that have unfolded in recent years. And we're going to hear in this panel from some of the people who were there at first hand. I'll introduce the moderator in 1 second, but I just want to make one note about one of the panelists, Frank Greaney, who's a former student of mine and who somehow managed to do something productive with his life despite having been taught by me, and who continues to do us and my colleagues at the law school at NUI Galway very, very proud. So with that very biased note, I will introduce the moderator, who is Ken Murphy. Ken is the former Director General of the Law Society, and to his great credit, one of his initiatives was to work and to recognize how the law and the legal system are portrayed in the media. So I can really think of nobody better suited to chair and moderate this panel. So please welcome Ken.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody, present or watching online. It's a wonderful pleasure, and I'm really thrilled and delighted to have been invited by Larry to chair this. I'm now going to invite the team of all the talents. We have 4 top court correspondents here with us, and I'm just going to, in the order in which they happen to be in my notes here, we have Vivienne Traynor, the RTE Courts reporter, Frank Greaney, Courts correspondent, News Talk and Today FM, Órla O'Donnell, Legal Affairs correspondent of RTE, and Conor Gallagher, crime correspondent of the Irish Times. I'd like them to come out now and take seats, please. I'm going to begin with a reference to the, and Larry remarked on the fact that I had been responsible for an initiative to help recognise excellence in media reporting and the way in which the media reports the law and legal issues, particularly the courts, to the public. But there's a connection with this summer school, which I'm going to, if you bear with me, I'm going to explain. In a very long time ago, 31 years ago, August of 1990, I think I'd only just arrived back from following the Irish soccer team in Italy, and I'd been invited. I was a practicing solicitor, a firm called A&L Goodbody. I was in their Brussels office, and through the New York office, I'd been invited to speak at the American Bar Association annual conference, with one of the biggest legal conferences in the world, 10,000 people attending it. It was being held in Chicago that year, and I spoke at my session, and it was a huge program. And one of the items, there was a lunchtime event, which, because I had an Irish interest, I was asked would I like to attend. And I attended it solely because of the identity of the star guest speaker. It was a big lunchtime event, and they called it the Gavel Awards. They present, the American Bar Association presenting awards to members of the media, in a very wide spectrum of members of the media, for excellence in their communication of law and legal issues to the public. And the reason I went to it, and I followed up, I saw the event, I thought the concept of the Gavel Awards, as they called it then, was so good that I brought it back to the Law Society of Ireland. We introduced it as the Justice Media Awards. All of our panellists here today are actually former winners over the years of the Justice Media Awards. It's been running since 1991, and it has so it's the longest running media awards competition in Ireland. But the reason and what prompted all of that was the speaker at that lunchtime event at the American Bar Association in Chicago in 1990 was Senator Edward Kennedy. So there is a connection that brings us here. His picture is still on the program for this event here for the Kennedy Summer School. And it was actually the connection with the iconic, magical political name from Irish American politics that actually started the Justice Media Awards. I wouldn't have gone to that event otherwise. All of them, all of our speakers here today have been winners of that award. Conor Gallagher, I know just last year, won the overall award in 2020 for an item following the final judgment in the Anna Kriegel case, which was, I'm told, it was published in the Saturday Irish Times, and it went on, was it 3 full pages of the Irish Times? It was certainly, we were told it was the longest single item that had ever been published in the Irish Times. It just shows how much interest there can be in law and courts in particular, because really, you know, there's so much of drama inherent in the courts, and there's so much of human stories, and we all love stories, and there's an unfolding story and there's an uncertainty of outcome. It's got so many elements that fascinate the public. The section, I'm going to begin with this, section 34(1) of the Constitution reads, "Justice shall be administered in courts established by law by judges appointed in the manner proposed by the Constitution and saved by blah," and it finishes in the end, and save in such special and limited circumstances, it shall be administered in public. The key message is section 34(1) provides that the law shall be administered in courts, administered in public. But how does the public know what's going on their behalf in the courts? And the essential, it seems to me, and the reason why I think this is such an important discussion is because public confidence in the justice system is based on their knowledge of what is actually being done in the courts. And yet nobody goes to the courts. Very few people go to the courts unless they have business there, unless they're a party with business before the courts. Other than that, they rely totally on reporting through mainstream media of the courts. The maintenance of public confidence in the justice system and in the rule of law itself, I think it is essential that we have excellence in court reporting. We have 4 people here who are professionals in all of that, and they have contributed, and we've had some email exchanges before this in terms of preparation. And I'm going to just begin now with a general question, because I want to recognize, I'm going to begin with Órla, but we're just going to, because I know that she came back to me quite strongly on this when I was talking about it, but I'm going to ask each of you in turn to come in relation to this. And the question I placed was, how intense or intolerable are the pressures on court reporters, given the requirements for instant, particularly in broadcast media, instant reporting of highly complex information that can only be summarized and has to be summarized in non-legal language that communicates to the general public, has to be understood by the general public, and yet any inaccuracy in that reporting carries huge risks. How pressurized is this?
Very is the answer to that. And it's just become more pressurised even just in the last 5 years. When I started out, your pressure would be the 1 o'clock television news and the 1 o'clock radio news, and you'd have to condense maybe a 500-page judgment into a minute and a half or minute-long report for the radio news. And now, sometimes your news editors might feel you failed if you haven't tweeted first. So you can have done everything, but if your tweet isn't ahead of the Irish Times, for example, in terms of giving the salient points, then your news editor will be going, why did that happen? I've actually heard rival news organisations, journalists being congratulated for being a millisecond before my tweet. You know, that's happened in the last 5 years. So it's very pressurised. You know, you have to condense very detailed legal arguments, nuances, and get to the kernel of the matter of why, what has happened, what the judgment is, what the decision is, what the sentence is, why it's important, and what is going to happen next. And you've got to do that very, very quickly, and you've got to produce it for radio, television, and online almost immediately, and make sure you're right, you know, and do that, you know, with you don't have the resources that maybe I've said to you before. We are in court on our own. We don't get access to a lot of the material that maybe other people in the courtroom are looking at. Juries get exhibits, they get to see the documents, they get to see all the detailed evidence. We don't get that. We have to look over screens and try and see what we can see in the 30 seconds that something might be displayed in court. So we have to make sure we're right. And then we have to broadcast it to the nation. And sometimes we're like, did I see that properly? Is that right? So it's very pressurised. I mean, we've been lucky and we have got it right, but you know, the stakes are high, because if you haven't got it right, it'll be mentioned in court, and you'll be hauled in, or rather your lawyers will be hauled in, and you'd be made to explain yourself.
Wow. Frank, have you ever beaten Órla to the punch in terms of getting something out just a millisecond before her? Is that the kind of pressure that you have to operate under?
It is, but I'd like to think, with Órla and Conor and Vivienne, there is, I see these guys as colleagues just as much as you would see them as competitors. And that's how it works down in the courts. You need to have those networks. I often say there's no such thing as an exclusive story down the courts. And while that's not necessarily completely true, when you're covering those big stories, you rely on your colleagues' ears. You may have heard something, a very strong line that you want to include in your reportage, but you mightn't be 100% sure. You're not going to go up and ask the witness. You're not going to ask the judge or the lawyers gathered. You'll ask your colleagues, the Órlas, the Conors, the Viviennes, and if they haven't heard it, you leave it out, because as Órla has mentioned, the stakes are high, and when you get it wrong, the consequences can be catastrophic. And I think our work is scrutinized now more than ever. In the past few years, when you've seen live tweeting from courtrooms, I've done it myself at high-profile trials. The Belfast rape trial, I'm sure everyone here is very familiar with that case. And I was based in Belfast for the entire length of that trial. I was live tweeting, I was taking a note, I was feeding into programming, I was delivering news bulletins on the hour, every hour. There was a huge interest in the story. And I'll tell you a funny story towards the end of that trial. It was held in Belfast, obviously, and it was on the 4th floor, the courtroom in Laganside Courts. And I was taking the lift up one morning like I did every day of the trial. And just before the door shut, I was on my own in the lift. A black boot stopped the door from closing. And it was the black boot of Frank O'Donoghue, who was representing one of the 4 men on trial, Stuart Olding. And Frank O'Donoghue was eating a banana, a quick breakfast, obviously, on his way to court. And he turned to me and he said, "You're Frank from Newstalk." And I said, "That's right." I said, "You're Frank, Stuart Olding's barrister." And he said, "Correct." And he turned to me again, and he still had this banana in his hand, half eaten. And he said to me, "Do you know what my wife and I do last thing at night when we get into bed? Do you know what we do?" And I was thinking,
Do you want to know?
Yeah, it's 11:15, Frank, let's keep it clean. He said, "My wife and I go through your tweets from the day. We find it's a great resource to see everything that happened throughout the day." Now, what Frank O'Donoghue was doing there was he was paying me a very nice compliment, firstly. I've no doubt about that. But he was also marking my card, And before that lift reached the 4th floor where the courtroom was, before the day's business got underway, I said to Frank, I don't know, is that a good thing or a bad thing? And he said, "Oh, it's a good thing. It's a good thing. For now." Bing! And the doors opened. And Frank went back into the courtroom. And I was left there thinking, again, it was very complimentary. But he was certainly letting me know, and this does happen for high-profile trials, that the media coverage is covered. Every tweet that goes out, every word that you utter in your news reports, every word that's published in the Irish Times, it's scrutinized, and that's a huge level of scrutiny. And one of the biggest achievements of my entire career is getting from one end of the Belfast rape trial to the next without finding myself in front of the judge. Yeah, absolutely.
But that's quite an elevator pitch that you've just described there. Did you feel that you were being put under? I think you said you felt you were being put cleverly under a bit of pressure there, were you, or did you? How did you feel?
In fairness to Frank O'Donoghue, I know he's come out afterwards and he's been very complimentary publicly about my own coverage of the trial, and Newstalk and Today FM, the organisations that I work for. He's been very complimentary. I don't think there was anything underhanded about what he said. I think
I wasn't suggesting that. I want to make that perfectly clear.
Yeah, absolutely. But that kind of pressure is the pressure that we deal with day to day, and rightly so, because you have to remember that. Around the Belfast rape trial, for example, there was a media frenzy of sorts, and there was it was almost like a circus environment, and I have countless stories of people coming up. It was almost like a sporting event in itself. But at the end of the day, as professionals, we had a job to do, and we had a very important job to do. And we had to remember every single second of that trial that the most important people were the people on trial, the 4 men in that dock at Laganside, and the witness who was giving evidence, the complainant, and obviously the men and women of the jury. So while Frank O'Donoghue was marking my card, so to speak, he wasn't telling me anything that I didn't already know. The stakes were high. Nobody wanted to be the person that brought down the Belfast rape trial. And there were a number of attempts by defence barristers who brought certain elements of media coverage to the judge's attention. And thankfully it did make it from one end of the trial to the next, and as we all know, all 4 men were acquitted. But it's just a good illustration of the pressures that we're under day to day, and there is good reason for it. But just to echo the point that Órla made a little bit earlier, we're on our own a lot of the time. The buck stops with us, and perhaps later in our discussion we'll talk a little bit about how we can be supported better by the other parties involved.
Vivienne, have you ever been under pressure at it? Have you ever wondered whether what you were saying is correct, or what's the most pressurised moment you've had reporting the courts?
We do come under the same pressures. We all do, and as Frank said, we do work in a very collegial environment in that we are all colleagues. And I've noticed that a lot of younger reporters coming along say they're terrified of going down to the courts, and they see it as such a difficult job. And I always say to them, the worst thing you can do is not ask a question of your colleagues. It's not a competitive environment. We all help each other out. But it was illustrated to me recently about the pressures. Órla and I are in a different position to perhaps radio reporters or print reporters, in that a few years back you might have 2 or 3 reporters from RTE in a particular court case if it was high profile. Now we're generally have to cover everything on our own. So when you look along the press bench and you see your colleagues, they might be just reporting for radio, just reporting for TV, or just for online or print, whereas we've got to do all of that. And then put into the mix social media and people who are tweeting, who have different demands or deadlines to us, and they're tweeting maybe a decision or a verdict or a ruling, while we're actually trying to write the copy to get it in. So that piles the pressure on. And an example that I can think of most recently of that was a while back, where there was a very, very high profile person who had been through the courts, and the High Court had endorsed a European arrest warrant for him. And he made a comment coming out of court, I'm off to be arrested. And PA, the news agency, had a reporter down there who's not very familiar with the courts as far as I know, and is not a court reporter, but the usual court reporters knew that this person had not yet been arrested under that European arrest warrant, that the court had endorsed the warrant, but PA flashed the story and pushed the story that this person had been arrested. And my phone was on fire. I had the news editor on to me. I had the online digital editor on to me.
How did you miss that,
saying,
Vivienne?
where's your copy, where's your copy? And I'm saying he hasn't. I had to ring them and say, he has not yet been arrested. I will file it when he is. And they were like, well, how do you know? But PA has pushed it. And I said, because I know the guy who's going to arrest him, and he's not yet in the building. And here he comes. I said, he's actually getting out of the lift now, and he is about to walk over to him. And yes, here we go. He's
the arrest will take place in the next 20 seconds.
You do feel that pressure from editors who are back at base, and obviously they're seeing it on a newswire and saying, well, why don't we have this? We want to push this. And I'm saying, hold on, it hasn't happened yet. So that's when your kind of local contacts and knowledge do come into play. But social media has led to putting more pressure on you to get the story first. We have to be careful, and part of the job is having the confidence, not just to get the story out quickly, but to know when not to put it out yet, until you've got it right. Because I know in RTE, the requirement is not to be always first, but to be always correct and right.
But if you might be, and I've heard, I'm sure all of you, saying that you literally come from court and you are speaking live to the nation within a minute or two, maybe seconds from leaving the courtroom. How can you manage to formulate all of this dense, intense level of information that you've been listening to for perhaps a couple of hours, and then summarize it, communicate it in generally understood terms, and not make an error? I mean, that is a very tall order, it seems to me. Have you ever, how much of a pressure does that create?
The biggest mistake you can make is to know your audience and know who you are speaking to and who you're communicating to. And somebody told me a long time ago, if you're doing a live, is to imagine that you're telling the story to your pal in the pub, or your mother or your sister. If they said, what's that case all about? Just tell them like you would tell. Don't try to speak to lawyers. Don't try to speak in legalese. You're not performing for the judge or the barristers. You're telling the story as you would tell your pal, and you can't go wrong if you do that.
But it's much easier, particularly speaking from a lawyer's point of view, to use the court language. Then you know you're using the correct legal term with precisely. Whereas you have to translate it to some extent into a different form of language, which inevitably must be a bit looser than the precision of the legal term.
it has to be a bit looser. It has to be very simple, understandable language. And the worst thing you can do is to fall into the trap of trying to appear knowledgeable about the law and using legal terms. So if you do want to bend the language or make it more accessible, sometimes you do have to say, am I changing the meaning of it there? And that's when you might have to hesitate, and you do have to be careful that in I won't say dumbing down, but in making it into plain English, that you don't change the nuance or the meaning of it. And that can be difficult at times, and that's why you do have to wait, take your time, make sure you've got it right first, rather than trying to be first on Twitter or, on any other social media channel.
I think the key is understanding it yourself completely. Because you can't explain something in the way that Vivienne has described to your friend if you don't quite understand it. So when I read a report that's full of legal jargon, or if I'm listening to something on the radio or watching it on television, if I see a lot of legal jargon entering that report, I sometimes wonder, does this person actually know what they're talking about? Because sometimes you lean on those turns of phrase if you don't quite understand what they mean. I think that's crucial.
Knowing lawyers as I do, I can assure you that that's the case. Conor, I mean, you live in a far more leisurely world. When you're reporting for the Irish Times, you don't have any pressures like this. I mean, you probably go back, go off, have lunch, and ultimately, what, by comparison, isn't your job a lot easier?
It's certainly easier to an extent. I can't imagine having to do lives straight after a case. At least I have an extra 5 minutes. But in Irish Times style, I like to have some smoked salmon and a Chardonnay maybe.
Exactly, as we would expect.
Yeah, no, but that time pressure is still very much there. I mean, we're all as journalists, we're all kind of obsessed with Twitter. Probably a little too obsessed, considering it's still only a fraction of the country who uses it as a platform. But, there is an expectation. You get the tweet out there incredibly quickly. Then you have to get what we've taken to call the flash out. So that's Graham Dwyer's guilty, and it's 3 paragraphs. And you have that prepared. Actually, what you'll have prepared is Graham Dwyer's guilty, hung jury, or Graham Dwyer's innocent, and you'll have all 3 going, and you'd fill in the blanks. Get that out super quickly, then your slightly longer report, and then your analysis of the case. Ideally, in a really big cases, you'll have a colour writer down with you, but most cases you won't, so they'll want colour from the courtroom, which is incredibly hard to write, especially in an ongoing trial, because it can be very dangerous writing colour in an ongoing trial.
There's cases on that, isn't there? There's
Absolutely.
About the reference to who was the character with the nail varnish was referred to.
Is that Catherine Nevin?
I think it was Catherine Nevin, and it was found objectionable that the reference had been made to her nail varnish in the colour writing while the case was ongoing.
It might be apocryphal. It was before my time slightly, but that newspapers are sending their fashion writers down to that case, was what I was told. So you've got all of that, and then inevitably, if it's a case that, say, Órla or Vivienne or one of the other reporters didn't happen to be in the case, you'll be getting a call from a radio show probably, or well, not for a few years, but now that we've made up News Talk.
Oh, that's News Talk. Do you still?
Yeah. So you'll be getting
you
those
can
calls.
Still have news Irish Times people on News Talk. Anyway, sorry, I didn't realise that.
Yeah, piece
broken out.
Okay. Yeah. Had been on Matt Cooper. It was great to be back. Right. They're thinking of getting rid of you now that I'm back. But so that intense pressure is there, and I've been caught out with it. Frank was saying that his greatest achievement was getting from the start of the Belfast trial to the end of the Belfast trial without getting called in front of the judge. Unfortunately, I can't make the same claim, and it's because we were kind of fish out of water to a certain extent, because it's different jurisdiction. 99% of it is the same, but some things are slightly different. So the jury broke to start their deliberations in that case, and you could kind of cut the tension with a knife. But we were also kind of relieved to be near the end, so we all scurried off to our respective hotels to start getting our copy ready for the verdict for whenever it would come. And then I got a phone call from another journalist saying I had to come back down to the court immediately, that the judge wanted to see me, and there's really not a worse feeling in the world.
Describe that feeling as you went in.
It's like being called up to the principal's office by 1,000. Do you know what I mean? Because the principal in this case can send you to jail. And it's because something we do all the time here.
The man who collapsed the Belfast rape trial.
That was the headline going through my head, and what we do down here is if a jury will often come back in the middle of their deliberations with questions, and we will generally report those questions. It's not a problem. So I had tweeted out the questions that the jury had come back with without any commentary, just here's what they want to know. They want to hear some statement again. They were all pretty technical. And one of the barristers for one of the defendants thought this was reporting something that hadn't been said in court. That because the rule is, the golden rule is, in a trial you can only report what the jury hears. So you can't report legal argument. You can't report obviously anything said outside the courtroom. But because the jury hadn't heard this technically, because only I think it was only the jury minder came in and handed the questions up, that I had broken that rule, even though the jury had asked those questions. So it was a case the barristers got up and they were kind of apologetically saying, we have a problem with this. And I got up, very, very, very sorry, Judge. You know, I didn't quite know that was the rule. And the judge, in fairness now, she was apology accepted. It was me and another reporter who were in trouble, but it's not an experience I'd like to repeat. Thankfully, the only time, and hopefully the last time as well.
But at those high-profile cases, what happens sometimes is the media is almost weaponized,
Yes.
especially by the defence. So if there's a very hot and heavy atmosphere around the case, if everybody's very stressed, the defence will start using any perceived slip-up by
Yes.
the media as something to add to the tension, because they're trying to say their clients are being victimised.
Exactly.
So,
Case can't go on because...
yeah, so in some cases they're trying to collapse the case. So that becomes an even greater layer of pressure and tension, because they're just waiting for you to make a mistake so they can use it against you and have the trial stopped, or have another black mark against the media and a pressure point for their client. So that has happened in it's become worse now. In the Anna Creagial trial, we would normally tweet just what's happened in court today. The judge says blah, blah, blah. The prosecution barrister says blah, blah, blah. And I was actually asked nicely not to do it anymore by the prosecution, because what we were getting back in comments on Twitter was so outrageous and so horrendous and so much in contempt of court that they couldn't control that, and they wanted, if we weren't tweeting, we wouldn't get this kind of thing.
You weren't in contempt of what was being said.
What was being said by, they're guilty of sin, or, that kind of thing. And then there also became a very, very difficult atmosphere where one of the defendants' lawyers and their family were they were trying to find problems with the media at every point, and they knew that the judge was very concerned about this trial, about 2 children being on trial for murder. So they kept using that against us and trying to find ways to get the judge to criticise us. So it was a very hostile, the most difficult trial and the most hostile trial in terms of the media that I've ever experienced.
That was absolutely the most hostile environment.
Can I just go back to, and Reeve was focusing on you as the chief representative of the print media here as distinct, and you wrote very extensively, as I indicated earlier, very, very extensively in the Irish Times on it. You were building up was that after the verdict, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was next day maybe, or that evening.
So you do have a slightly different role, or you report in a different way, obviously, from broadcast. But are you conscious of that, or what opportunities does it allow you? You can do other things because you've got space and time, only a little bit more space and time, but more space and time than the broadcast media reporters have, don't you?
Yeah, definitely, and you've got time in the evening to type up your notes and see how that day's evidence would fit into the long read at the end, because now news editors really love the long read at the end of a big trial. They're really well read. The public really like to read them, especially for something like the Anna Creagial trial, because it was such a horrible, dark trial that I spoke to a lot of people and they actually tuned out of the trial itself, just because the daily... And it was kind of all over the news. It was very hard to avoid, but especially people with young kids, in the morning time, they'd be switching the radio off, because they didn't want to expose their children.
So upsetting.
To that. Absolutely, yeah. In fact, there was a 14-year-old victim and 2 15-year-olds, or 2 13-year-olds accused. But with the long read, you're kind of obviously working on it as you go along. But if the verdict goes one way, then you have to cut a huge amount of it out, and you have to put a totally different slant on it, So for that, I had alternative paragraphs for depending on which way the verdict was going, because if for some reason those 2 boys were found innocent, you can't say this is what happened, because a jury has found well, there's not enough evidence to say that happened beyond a reasonable doubt, so you can't say it factually. They were found guilty, which made it easier to put together because you can be a lot more certain in what you're saying. You can say this happened because the jury found that it did happen, but if it was the other way around, it certainly would have been a much kind of more watered down kind of piece.
Just something about, maybe we just move away from the really high pressure, high profile, public obsessed with type trials to a more daily type, cases in the criminal courts, and maybe even look beyond the criminal courts, into the civil courts and more general reporting when you don't have those kind of pressures on. I mean, do you tend to stick with a trial? Now, trials are getting longer, as we know, but to stick with a trial right from the beginning to the end, or do you have to pick and choose what you're going to cover? I know in terms of, I mean, we were exchanging emails a little bit earlier. I might come to you, Vivienne, on this. Is how do the cases that make the news get chosen? Because I made the point that only a tiniest fraction of the cases that go before the courts are ever reported in the media. 99.99 something of cases are never reported in the media. It's a tiny proportion of cases are reported in the media. And even then, only a tiny proportion of what actually happens in the courtroom is ever actually reported, because the case goes on for hours, possibly days and weeks, and yet you've got a limited number of words and airtime and so on. How are the just to make the question, how are the cases that are reported in the media chosen, and who chooses them, and on what basis of what criteria?
Cases can take you by surprise sometimes. They can appear on the face of them to be very mundane or run-of-the-mill. If that doesn't sound too trite about certain criminal cases, they're all important to those involved in them. But we have to make a judgment call. And if we know that something is going to be very high profile or of interest to the public rather than in the public interest, we'll know that we need to attend every day. At other times, we will go at the beginning and the end, and we rely on agency copy in the interim, and we can dip in and out of them.
Could you explain line agency copy? What is that?
Yeah, so obviously there are, 20-something high courts sitting at any given time in the four courts. There are many, many more in the CCJ. So because most news organisations only have one court reporter or two in our case, you can't be everywhere. So we would use CCC in the criminal courts and Ireland International. So they have a pool of reporters or a team of reporters, and they would supply us with copy for cases that we can't attend every hour of every day. So that gives us the background information we need at the end of a trial if we haven't been there for a portion in the beginning, because we'll have to go off and report on something else. So we don't have the luxury of sitting in on day one of every trial, unless we know we are going to get a story for television and radio out of that case every day. And very often you will see us at a case every day from start to finish. But the majority of cases we can't attend every day. So we have that backup of agency copy to keep us up to date on everything and to keep our website updated. So really, Órla and I will choose on a daily basis what we feel we will get a story out of each day. The news conference that morning might have a different opinion and say, actually, no, we're really interested in this case, so can you go to that instead? So it's a balancing act, and we don't always get it right in terms of what should be covered. Sometimes it's just a case will take off, it has some quirky elements to it that rightly or wrongly will capture the attention of the public, and we end up sticking with it. We've often had very high profile murder trials, for example, that have captured everybody's attention. We've been there every day, our editors want it every day, it's all over the newspapers. And because of the people involved or the characters or the demographic involved. And the following week, you might come across a case in almost identical circumstances, perhaps maybe the murder of a woman in a relationship, and there's no interest in it. And that has been quite striking over the years.
How do you explain what creates that difference? Why are some cases reported and not others?
I think it can be something as simple as the amount of publicity the event got at the time in the newspapers, how many people were interested at the time, and then there's a lot of hype coming up to this trial, where there are an awful lot of other cases that go on involving very tragic and very similar circumstances that just don't get that traction for whatever reason. Now, we do have a role to play in that, and there are times when we have to say, actually, that case is not all that important. There are many, many others like it. There's no standout feature of that, and we perhaps should concentrate on that, or maybe not give it as much coverage as perhaps editors might want sometimes. They say, oh, I want a live on that, and we say, no, it doesn't actually merit that. So it's a bit of toing and froing, but also we are quite insulated sometimes down in the courts, and what we might find interesting or important, you have to have other eyes on it, and that's where your editors come in and say, no, actually, people are not that interested in that. They prefer this. So it's kind of a group decision, and it's about taking other people's opinions in on a daily basis. But sometimes it's hard if another news outlet is going big on something because they wanted to cover that story that day. It doesn't necessarily mean that we have to follow suit.
It has to have almost an unusual feature, really. That's, I was saying to you, when I started off my newsletter, if there was a murder, we were doing it. It was going to be on the RTE 6 o'clock news. That does not happen now. There can be 3 or 4 murder cases, and maybe we won't cover any of them that night. It has to have sometimes it is that it's something really unusual. Like, that's what news is. It's something unusual. So there's a whodunit aspect to it. Did that person actually? There's a little bit of a doubt about whether the accused could actually have done it, or there's something very specifically strange or unusual about it. That can be the reason. But we don't. I mean, there are cases. Like
Gangland cases at the moment are very high profile.
They are, there's something else politically in the news that makes the court case more interesting. But there's, there were stories that I would have done in the civil courts that would have been very worthy and very RTE, Irish Timesy, that we would have covered every day. For example, I remember covering Paddy McKillen's loans when he was challenging NAMA, taking his loans into NAMA at the end of the recession. And we did that almost every day for the news. It wouldn't get on the news every day now. Things have changed. There's a perception that things have to be more interesting and more easily accessible to people before they get on the news.
I mean, somebody I have huge admiration for is Mary Carolan of the Irish Times, who's sort of the doyenne of court reporters, been reporting for decades. Often doesn't even have her byline, but she does produces the court reporting, and she will do cases, sort of guardianship cases or something that we as lawyers might feel the public should know more about these kind of cases, but they don't seem to have the slightly newsy value or the,
That's where the value of our online site has come into its own, because very often a story for us won't make television because there are no pictures, for example, or you can't identify the parties involved.
Do you need pictures to get a TV? You can't.
Usually, or you can do, not always. If it's important
this is the
enough,
walking,
you can just
walking
do it
out
live.
of the CCJ with the cameraman walking backwards.
How many more people do you want to see walking in and out of a building? And that is something that we do often struggle with. But if the story is important enough, you can do it live, you can do it, just in a Q&A, and you do it. But our website has provided us with a huge outlet now for all of those kinds of stories, where they're not necessarily television friendly, but they need to be told. And that's where it's increased our workload, but it's a great outlet for us now. And like Conor doing long reads at the end of a trial, we now have that opportunity to do that outside of our work from day-to-day news bulletins, where we condense everything into 90 seconds for a TV package, or 40 or 50 seconds for a radio piece, and you can do your Q&As on programs, but they're still short enough. Now we have that opportunity to write these analysis pieces and longer pieces and try to give our readers and our audience a little bit of a sense of what went on in the court, a little bit more colour writing that maybe you can't do in a day-to-day news package, and that has been a huge change for us, our ability to do that.
But it's also resources. Like, if Frank was to say, I feel that I want to do, if he was to try and do what Mary does, like to report on wardship stories or those very, very interesting and very important stories, he'd have to take himself off, or I'd have to take myself off the daily grind of stories, and then the news editor has to find somebody else to do your job, and then they look around and they haven't got somebody. So if they're, news organisations are less resourced than they were in terms of reporters, there aren't the people to do it, and they're not going to give you the resources.
Frank, how are resources I mean, you cover 2 radio stations, don't you? News Talk and Today FM.
Yeah, so I work for Bauer Media, News Talk and Today FM. I'm sure people would be very familiar with them, and a lot of the other stations like Dublin's 98 FM and News Talk then have a network. They provide content to local radio stations, about 30 radio stations across the country that we would provide content to.
But I've heard you on the sort of Pat Kenny show, and that kind of, you're coming in reporting on not just news bulletins. Yeah,
exactly. So I mean, there are a lot of ingredients, I suppose, in the mix-up of what I do. When I started out, it was just feeding into your short news bulletin. So that's trying to sum up 2 to 4 hours of evidence in 45 seconds. which is very difficult, when you have to be fair and you have to be balanced and you have to give both sides.
I just want to repeat that for the audience. 4 hours of evidence in 45 seconds. That is condensation.
It's one of the biggest challenges, in fact, is, you will have your morning session, so 2 hours bringing you up to lunchtime, and then you're condensing that for a short report for lunchtime, and then you're moving the story on, and that's maybe where it's a little bit different to print, where you're getting the full story the following day. In broadcast radio and television, we're giving those regular updates, so the story will change throughout the afternoon, but yeah, certainly, even when I go on with the likes of Pat Kenny or Matt Cooper on The Last Word on Today FM, you're getting maybe 8 to 10 minutes, which still isn't a lot of time to tell your story and to do it in a fair and balanced and accurate way. But I suppose that's where the skills lie, is covering all bases. And you develop this kind of sixth sense almost when you're sitting through all of those hours of evidence. Things will stick out to you that simply have to go into your report. You're not just filling time for the sake of it.
One of the things that I did write to all of you about, and you all came back very, very strongly on, and we don't want to run out of time before doing it. And the question I put to you was, what is your biggest bugbear complaint about how the court system makes your job unnecessarily difficult, and what could be done about it? All together now, or one by one. We start with Conor and just work through. What are the things that should be done and the court system should do to facilitate in the public interest? It's not in your guys, your interest. It's in the public's right to know accurately and in a timely way what's going on in their courts. I have an idea of what you're going to say, but each of you in turn, what should be done?
Well, this probably isn't the biggest problem, but it's the first one that comes to mind, and it's one I think maybe we all find very annoying, is a trend that's emerged of someone will be accused of usually a sexual crime, but you'll be entitled to name them. The victim or the complainant enjoys complete anonymity, but you're entitled to name them. But the defence barristers have started applying for anonymity for their clients, and we've seen judges granting anonymity for these people, even though there's no legal basis for it. And so that'll be granted in the district court. Sometimes it'll be overturned once it gets to the circuit or the central criminal court. But some judges don't seem to know the law in that sense. And maybe these people should be entitled to anonymity, but that should be codified in law, and it shouldn't be one rule for one person who happens to have a barrister who tries this trick, and another rule for another person whose name will be splashed all over the Irish Times or on Newstalk or on RTE. So that's very frustrating. I suppose other instances where judges don't know the law about what you can and can't be reported and will make kind of ad hoc decisions, and sometimes it could be nearly like if they've had a good lunch that day, they will make a decision that goes your way, and if they're annoyed by some other thing, they can make a decision that goes the other way. And that can be very frustrating. Like, I've been kicked out of court before, with the judge, after a barrister said I'd no right to be there. Then you have to call your editor, get your own barrister down at considerable expense. He'll go in and just point to the thing that says you can be there, and then you're allowed back in. But you've already missed the case, so it's kind of pointless in that sense. So that would be my one for the...
Órla, biggest bugbear. What should be done to make the system better?
I think it's incredible that the role of the court reporter, and I don't mean us as aren't we brilliant little people for reporting the courts, but the role of the public, the right of the public to be there is just not generally respected in court. There is a feeling all the time, and I'm doing this for 15 years, I'm 47 years old, and they still treat us like bold children. They believe that we're going to be bold. If we're given any latitude at all, we're going to do something bold and we're going to mess up the trial. And so there's very little respect and very little effort to try and make sure that we have all the information we need to report. For example, as I said, documents. Sometimes there can be elaborate spreadsheets of text messages and who said what to whom, and everybody else in the court is looking at it and we aren't allowed to see it. And in fact, if we try to see it, there's a complaint raised. In the trial of David Drum, we wrote to the DPP, all the news organisations together in advance, because we knew it would be very document heavy, there'd be lots of financial information, and of course there's numbers, and if you get the number wrong you're going to be hauled up before the judge. And we asked, can we see what the jury sees? So can we have a screen, can we have a laptop, can we have exhibits so that we can see it and we can report it accurately? And no was the answer. In the UK, the Crown Prosecution Service has a protocol in place where exhibits are automatically given to the to the media after the jury have seen them. That doesn't exist here. And there isn't any engagement. There doesn't seem to be any will or any desire to engage with us to try and make sure that and it's in everybody's interest, because if they engage with us, then problems can be avoided.
Who's they? Is it
I
the
think
court
it's-
service?
I think
Is it the judiciary? Is
I
it
think it's the DPP.
political,
It's the
system? Is it the
state.
state solicitors service?
It's the DPP, it's the state.
DPP.
And without trying to bash them around the place, I think that going forward and looking forward, that it would be great in controversial trials where they would meet us in advance and say, these are going to be the issues, and can we have your understanding? Because, for example, in the Anna Creagil trial, issues arose very early on, and they were used as a stick to beat the media all through, that we had made these mistakes early on, that could have been resolved by everybody meeting and saying, there's going to be a problematic witness at the beginning, there's going to be an issue about a school that can't be named, and we would have all said, of course, because we don't want to collapse the trial either, and we don't want to damage people's trust in us, and we don't want to hurt people that shouldn't be hurt. So those kind of things, I think there should be an engagement, and there should be a respect, because I'm not there because I want to be there. I'm there representing the 500,000 viewers and more who read the RTE site. We want to report accurately, and we're there for the people of Ireland, and I think there should be more of a partnership rather than a kind of a willingness to look at us as people who are going to mess up and we shouldn't be trusted.
I'm going to come to each of you in turn, but I'm just going to say to the audience, in a few minutes' time, I'm going to open it to the audience if anybody has a question. I am requesting questions, not arguments or stories or anecdotes or whatever, but questions to the distinguished audience here. I'll come to you in a few minutes for that. Frank, what could or should be done to make, in the public interest, reporting of the courts better?
I think there are some steps that could be made right now that would make all of our working lives so much easier, make the system so much better. You opened up this discussion by mentioning the Constitution and the fact that justice needs to be administered in public. While every Irish citizen has a right to be in most courtrooms, there are certain cases that are held behind closed doors for obvious reasons, where identification is an issue. But every Irish citizen is entitled to be there. They can't be. So we're the eyes and ears of the Irish public. We're fulfilling a very serious and important role, but we're completely left to our own devices to do it. We're not considered officers of the court. I'm not saying here for one second that we should be considered officers of the court, but equally, we're not ghosts. We're not invisible. We don't have ulterior motives to be there. We're not salacious. We're not sensationalizing things. We're not making a family's tragic circumstances even more difficult than they need to be. We're fulfilling a very important role. You take the criminal courts of justice, this relatively new building that was built at the cost of millions of taxpayers' money, and the media room seems to be an afterthought. It's a windowless room on the ground floor of the building. We have no access to Wi-Fi. We don't get access to court papers, as Órla was pointed out. Judgments are hard to come by. I remember Angela Cairns. You may be familiar with Angela Cairns, the former chief executive of the rehab group, and she took a high court action against an Oireachtas committee for the way they handled a piece when she appeared before them in relation to some controversy that was going on at the charity at the time. A big judgment. It brought some serious issues into the courtroom, issues about absolute privilege in all committees, issues about the separation of powers between the legislature and the judiciary. And the judgment is 57 pages long. 57 pages weren't read out that day. Huge public interest in it. I think there was one hard copy handed around to maybe 10 journalists that were there. Orla O'Donnell and I don't know if you remember this, but we had to go down to the law library to get a print of that hard copy. I was on the phone to a producer of the Pat Kenny show, literally waiting to go on live. And the first question that Pat asked me is, how have they arrived at that decision? And I'm flicking through a printed copy. It's still warm in my hands as I'm trying to find out how the judge arrived at this decision. Surely, and I think the pandemic has been good in that sense. We've had remote hearings, we've had electronic judgments, we've had a little bit more access. But there seems to be some sort of fear factor with the DPP, like Órla mentioned, that they maybe feel that they're going to open up the floodgates, when the consequences of us not being able to do our jobs properly are catastrophic for the likes of the DPP. You can bring a trial down, for example. We just want to do our job and do it well and get it right. Little things like having access to Wi-Fi and court papers and publicly accessible documents, in my opinion, should be.
In general terms, specifics, but do you sense, because I sense from all of you, a feeling that there's a lack of respect for court reporters and for, in a way, for the public's right to know, because the public can only know through, nobody in the public is going to read detailed judgments. They will know based on how you report it. I mean, what
Yeah, I
could be
think
done
that-
to improve things?
I think there's a lack of recognition of the role we play within the justice system and how important a role that is. Without blowing our own trumpets, as Órla said, we are there as the eyes and ears of the public. And Frank spoke about the little things. Well, one little thing that would be nice as a court reporter is a seat.
Yeah.
We don't have designated press benches in
It
all
is.
the
I'm
old
always
district
astonished
courts.
in court, and I see
We have to battle to
a
get
reporter
a seat.
right at the back of the court
And
trying to take
sta-
notes standing
well,
up.
try standing at the back of a court with a laptop in one hand. And if you leave your seat, as we often have to do to run out to do bulletins or to file copy or to do a voiceover for radio,
That seat isn't there when you
the
come back.
seat is gone by, it's taken by either another reporter, which is fair enough because we're good at kind of making room for each other, but it's taken by a member of the public who may resent you coming in and saying, sorry, I need that seat. They'd say, well, I was here first. And you're like, but you're just here for yourself. I'm here to actually tell the rest of
500,000
the,
listeners. Yeah.
You know, and it is it's a little thing, but it's a really important thing. Just the physical facilities within a courtroom. Every other person who's working in that courtroom has the space and the facilities to do their job in comfort and in peace. We don't. We can be sitting in a really hostile environment with certain parties to a case over our shoulder, looking at what we're writing, sitting to our right or to our left. So that's just one of the practical things. And to echo what Órla was saying about access to information, I could not tell you the amount of times I've been in court where a barrister has gone to read through an affidavit, which will be the real meat of a case for us, what someone has said. It's a sworn statement. And the judge will wave them on and say, it's okay, I've read the papers. Everybody in that courtroom who's working has access to that affidavit, to that sworn statement, and all the other documents except us. And we have to go out at 1 o'clock and report very accurately on that case without having access to that. We may get access to them later on at the end of the day when it's probably too late for us, and only then on a grace and favour basis if you happen to know one of the legal teams and they give it to you. But there's no obligation, and they really are or should be public documents, and we were promised them a long time ago. From the court service that all of this would be put online, and it still hasn't happened.
I have to say I couldn't agree more. We've time for a couple of questions. Any hands up? Anybody got a question for please? Sorry, was that no? Yes. Now I'm going to repeat your question because it won't be heard by the people listening in. So if you give us the question quickly, and I'll repeat it then, please. Well, the question, a tiny bit tongue-in-cheek, I think, is that Conor was saying earlier that he writes almost two versions, both the guilty and the not guilty version, and then he has to decide, has he ever made a mistake and put the wrong one? Isn't the famous picture of the 1948 American election was Dewey and Truman, and they had Dewey wins, Truman wins, and they had the big headlines. Have you ever got it wrong there?
Thankfully, I haven't, but it has happened.
Well, that's what sub-editors are for.
Well, not if it's not if you're tweeting it, of course, or
Yeah.
if and with those cases where they're massively high profile, the news editor is sitting there ready to publish whatever you send. So they might read through it once to make sure you spelt guilty right, you know.
Yeah.
And then it's straight out on the website, and there's of course a push note that goes out, and then and push notes now, it's like it immediately appears on people's phones. And there was a case there a couple of years ago. There was one reporter there, he was a stringer, and he sent out the wrong verdict, and everyone pushed the story. Like, so as a push note, so you had Irish Times, probably RT, I'm not sure, Irish Independent, all three completely wrong result of the case. Do you remember what that was?
No, I actually think RT didn't get it wrong.
That's why she doesn't remember it, but you do.
I think it was John Gilligan.
John Gilligan, yes.
Lost his appeal against, I think, his last-ditch effort to keep his ill-gotten gains. And the judgment beforehand, somebody thought that the judge was talking about the John Gilligan case when they were actually talking about a different case. And the Irish Times and the Independent pushed out saying John Gilligan wins his appeal. And 20 minutes later, we said John Gilligan loses his appeal. So then we all had to. So yes, I use that sometimes as an example.
So the answer to your question is it has happened or something
It's a
similar.
worst nightmare. Everybody's
Another
worst
question there in the front row, please. Frank, actually, the question is, at a human level, does reporting on cases, is it disturbing, is it upsetting? And Frank, you emailed me about that. What were your comments on that?
I think you'd have to have a heart of stone not to be affected by these tragic stories that you're covering day in, day out. A lot of people here will be very familiar with the Mr. Moonlight murder trial, which, a lot of people were interested in day to day. And, that was a very distressing case. And to go from that then straight into Anna Kriagel, there was very little crossover. In fact, I think the Anna Kriagel trial started even before the Mr. Moonlight trial had finished. So you don't even have that opportunity to just take a breath. I think you have to be good at leaving it at the door, because if you're taking that stuff home with you day in, day out, that's not living. I'm often humbled, but also a little bit puzzled when people ask me how I am. I've been asked live on air after covering a case, and people will ask me how I am. And I'm puzzled because, at the end of the day, who cares? It's the people that find themselves in those situations through no fault of their own, that have had a loved one, the Geraldine and Patrick Kriagels of this world who have lost, Anna at 14 years of age in such a violent way. I often think about them, and doing Anna's story justice, and that's how you get through it. But I don't know if you remember this story, Vivienne, but it's one that's just popped into my mind. It was a case, a woman was given a victim impact statement. Her husband had died in a workplace accident. He worked down at the Dublin Docklands, and he was killed tragically by one of those large cranes that you see moving around the Docklands, and the company was held criminally responsible and convicted. And she was giving a victim impact statement, and you and I were sitting side by side, and this woman was talking about her last memory of her husband. He had gone to work that morning. They had a row the night before, so they hadn't sorted out their differences, and he would usually give her a kiss goodbye in the morning. He didn't that morning, and she didn't want one that morning because they hadn't resolved this row, and she didn't know that was obviously going to be the last time that she saw her husband. And she was talking about dancing around their home when they first bought it, and dancing around the kitchen and tricking around the kitchen. She had tears rolling down her cheeks. I almost did too, and you and I were barely able to type listening to that.
But these, again, as we said, and I'm looking at the time is ticking down here, but these are the human stories. Even though they're not just court reports, these aren't fiction. These are these are real stories. These aren't the sort of things that appear on TV dramas. These are real stories that you're dealing with all the time.
Very often, Ken, it's not only the main people involved in a case that will be upsetting or that you'll see. It can often be something on the sidelines. There are some very unfortunate people that you will come across in the criminal courts in particular, and it might have nothing to do with a case that you're actually covering that day. And some of the things that that I have found deeply upsetting are just little vignettes that you might come across, something unfolding in somebody's life, in a family life, might not even be connected to the case that you're covering. And that will strike you, because you do have a very professional face on when you're covering a case, but when you're maybe going off for your lunch or packing up for the day, you'll come across some very sad situations just on the sidelines, or maybe people that, no one ever really talks about in a case, like the mother of an accused, or the family of an accused person, or someone who's been taken off to jail. That's not something we ever report on, really, is their reaction. That can be quite striking and quite upsetting to see them and how they're coping with the tragedy that's unfolding for their family too. So it's coming from all angles, really.
I'm going to have to cut across now because we are out of time, and we didn't get to touch on one of the topics we were going to talk on, was social media and the impact it's having on court reporting. But I think, I hope you agree with me, that we've had an opportunity to gain a real insight into the way a highly skilled process in the public interest undertakes place, the reporting of the courts, by 4 outstanding exponents of it. And I just want to say, I have the height of regard for all of them and everybody who reports the courts. I think it's an extremely difficult job, but an extremely important job, because it underpins public confidence in the justice system and the rule of law. It could not be more important. I want to thank the audience, and I want to thank Vivienne, Frank, Órla, and Conor, and all of you for participating, anybody who's listening online, and apologies for going 1 minute 57 over time, but we're going to finish now. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.